No one saw the folder, no signatures, no applause, just a silence so thick it cut through marble. Inside a locked conference room, buried beneath a luxury summit in West Africa, a former American president leaned forward and named his price: 60% of your gold, 60% of your oil. That's the cost of peace. It was not a threat. It was an assumption that silence meant surrender, that a poor nation would always take the deal. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not speak. He sat across the table in a uniform still carrying the dust of his village. No aid, no tie, no smile, just the kind of stillness that unnerves empires. At that moment across the Sahel, the radios crackled with old songs. In Paris, traders refreshed their screens. In Ouagadougou, the silence became news. Because when a man refuses to answer, the world starts asking questions. In Kaya, a grandmother muttered, "He didn't say yes." In Brussels, the contracts were printed anyway. In Washington, they whispered, "We gave him the offer. Now let's see how long he lasts." Stay with us. If you've ever wondered what happens when an African nation looks a superpower in the eye and says nothing, not yes, not no, just silence, then stay with us, because this isn't just diplomacy. It's the sound of sovereignty waking up. Where are you reading this from? Type your city below. Let the world know you're listening. Kaya was never meant to make history. It was the kind of place where the land cracked before the harvest came and the wind carried more dust than prayer. A town not marked on most maps, but that was before the silence, before the president said nothing. In the days after the meeting, the price of sugar doubled. Fuel trucks moved slower. People didn't talk politics at the market. Not because they didn't care, but because something old and heavy had returned, the feeling that decisions were once again being made elsewhere. But this time, something was different. At the edge of Kaya, in a one-room school with a broken blackboard and chickens wandering through the door, Madame Mariama Zongo, a retired teacher, gathered her pupils and asked them one question. If you had to choose between money or soil, which would you give away? A boy raised his hand and said, "I have no money and the soil won't grow." Another girl whispered, "But if we lose the land, we lose ourselves." The class fell silent, not the kind born of fear, but of knowing. At the marketplace, old men leaned on canes and weighed the rumors. Traoré refused them. "That's why they've slowed the wires," one said. He didn't refuse. He delayed, another replied. "It doesn't matter," a third muttered. "They'll punish us either way." In Burkina Faso, punishment rarely wore a uniform. It came through delayed grain shipments, power outages, blocked credit. It came not as an invasion, but as a slow suffocation. And yet, even as the pressure built, there was something deeper forming in the dust conversation. Beneath a mango tree in the village of Tikare, elders held a fireless council, not to complain but to ask. If the world shuts its door, will we open our own granaries? Can we feed ourselves if the West freezes our accounts? Will our children forgive us for bowing or for standing? These weren't policy debates. They were ancestral murmurs passed from voice to voice like a drumbeat before a storm, and all of them revolved around one man, the young captain who did not speak. In the capital, newspapers printed guesses. Foreign analysts speculated on coup rumors, IMF retaliation, or civil unrest. But in Kaya, something far less visible began to stir. The baker started using local millet instead of imported flour. A mechanic reopened a shuttered pump to fix a village borehole for free, and Mariama the teacher began rewriting her curriculum. "If the world cuts off our knowledge, then we'll teach what the world forgot," she said. She scrawled on the blackboard with charcoal food. Water, land, dignity. No one gives these. We grow them. Elsewhere, fear did not disappear. It adapted. Some families pulled their children from school afraid of instability. Some whispered that perhaps taking the deal, even a bad one, was better than drought. But even in their doubt, they watched how no military trucks rolled into Kaya, watched how no arrest orders were issued, watched how the president still hadn't spoken. It was not apathy, it was calculation. People were not waiting for instruction, they were waiting for proof. Then came the letter, unconfirmed, unsigned. circulated by radio and scribbled on paper. It claimed that Western investors were preparing sanctions, that the World Bank had suspended rural infrastructure loans, that Burkina Faso would soon be isolated. For many it felt like prophecy, but for Mariama it felt like a beginning. They're telling us what they always told us, that we are too weak to stand alone, she told her students. But maybe they're wrong. Maybe for the first time in our lives they're afraid we'll prove them wrong. That night a fire was lit in Kaya. Not of protest, not of anger. A circle of women gathered grinding shea nuts by hand, not because they had orders, but because the factory in the city had paused operations. And beside them, a group of teenage boys sharpened farming tools with stones, humming old war songs under their breath. They didn't carry signs, they didn't chant slogans, but they were choosing, quietly, together, to act before being told, to prepare before collapse, to believe before being convinced. And what about you? If you had no microphone, no passport, no army, but only your voice and your soil, would you wait for the world to give you permission to rise, or would you build with what they said was worthless? Tell us in the comments, what would you do if they turned off the lights, but your neighbors held candles? Because maybe the new Africa does not begin with elections. Maybe it begins with quiet preparation in villages like Kaya. The room was too cold, deliberately so. Not the chill of air conditioning, but the kind of cold that says, you do not belong here. It was not the United Nations, not the African Union. It was something quieter. A table oval, a list of names unprinted, flags absent, only briefcases and translators, and behind each man a power he did not name out loud. At the head sat a representative of the IMF. To his left, a private equity advisor from France. Next, a man from the American State Department, not high enough to be held accountable, but close enough to deliver ultimatums. Across from them sat a man without notes, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. They began without introduction. Burkina Faso has debts, frozen infrastructure, fragile exports. This is not sustainable. We are prepared to offer relief, structured, with guarantees, based on cooperation. 60% of your gold reserves. In exchange, your economy stabilized within the quarter. It was said in rehearsed tones, not threatening, not persuasive, just inevitable like rain from a gray sky. Traoré listened. He didn't scribble. He didn't blink. He didn't even pour water into the untouched glass beside him. He let the words hang in the air like dust refusing to settle. A second proposal followed, more subtle, more brutal. Oil concessions to be renegotiated. American companies will manage the fields. Security guaranteed through joint operations. No boots, only advisors. Discreet. Then came the softest line, the one meant to sound like friendship. You will remain in power, Captain. But power is only real when it's recognized. Let us help you secure your future. Silence. A flicker passed through Traoré's eyes. Not fear, not pride, just remembrance. Of the men who came before him. Of Sankara felled by bullets fired from within. Of Lumumba, whose courage was buried under European memos. Of leaders who spoke too loudly and disappeared too quietly. But he spoke none of this. Instead, he leaned forward, resting both forearms on the table, and said, Burkina Faso has always paid its debts. With minerals, with crops, with blood. What has that bought us? No one answered. He continued, your aid builds roads to your own ports. Your loans return with interest. Your soldiers leave and our graves stay full. The American shifted. The Frenchman coughed. The IMF man smiled, the polite kind, the corporate kind. Captain, the world is complex. No one is to blame. This is about growth, global harmony. Traoré's voice was low, almost tired. This is about obedience. And I am not your student. There was a pause. A long one, then the final card was played. You still have time to accept. If not, well, markets respond. Credit ratings fall. Reserves dry up. Leadership too becomes unstable. It wasn't a threat. It was a ritual. This was how nations were bought, not with bullets, with spreadsheets, with silences, with handshakes no one dared record. Traoré stood, slowly, not out of anger but out of refusal. He looked at the table, not at the men, but at the shape of the meeting itself. oval, endless, designed so no one sat at the head, so no one took blame. He broke the symmetry by walking away. No final statement, no raised voice, just his back, just his exit. And when he reached the door, he turned once, just enough to say, "If you want our gold, bring shovels. If you want our oil, bring buckets. But if you want our souls, prepare to leave with nothing." That line did not make headlines. It was not quoted in official summaries, but in the hallways of diplomacy it echoed like a scream. And outside, far from that carpeted room, the consequences began to unfurl. The World Bank paused its grants. The EU froze development funds. A French media outlet published a dossier implying corruption within Traoré's cabinet. Burkina Faso hadn't refused, but it had not obeyed. And in the world of empire, that is worse than rebellion. That night, Traoré returned to the presidential compound in Ouagadougou. He removed his jacket, washed his hands at a public tap, and sat beneath a neem tree planted by school children last spring. Around him, the compound was still, but his thoughts weren't. He remembered Kaya. He remembered Mariama and the children who had no chalk. He remembered the woman at the well who whispered, "He hasn't said yes." He looked up at the sky and murmured, "I still haven't. A moment for you." If you were in that room seated beside the captain, would you have asked him to take the deal to save your job, your comfort? Or would you have walked out with him? Let us know. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done when your nation's dignity was up for auction? Because one day your children may ask you not what you believed, but what you stood for when the silence began. It was not a speech. There was no podium, no rows of journalists, no camera lights dancing on polished wood. It was a courtyard cracked and sun-beaten. Behind the captain, a concrete wall bore the faded slogan, "Dignité ou rien." Dignity or nothing. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. The people had waited 3 weeks. 3 weeks of headlines, sanctions, whispers of coup. Now he stood before them, not as a president, but as one of them. He looked down at his boots before he spoke, not for effect, for grounding. Then he said only this: "They asked for 60% of what belongs to you. I said no." The silence that followed was not disbelief, it was recognition. A woman in the crowd clutched her shawl tighter. A young mechanic exhaled like he had held his breath for decades. An old man raised his fist not in anger but in salute, because the country had heard enough speeches. This was not a performance. It was an act of remembering that sovereignty was not a flag or an anthem. It was the ability to say no and mean it. Within hours, the world responded. The IMF issued a statement. Burkina Faso's decision undermines regional stability. The European Commission suspended aid, citing non-cooperation with global frameworks. The African Union called an emergency review of military transitions. CNN called it reckless nationalism. Al Jazeera called it defiant populism. The BBC called it a test for West African democracy. But in the marketplaces of Bobo Dioulasso, the headlines were read aloud like verses from a familiar book, and in Kaya Mariama Zongo wrote the word freedom on her blackboard in white chalk. She asked her students what it meant. A boy stood and said, "It means we choose hunger over chains." That week, credit lines were slashed. Banks reported technical issues. Telecom networks slowed to a crawl, and yet no one rioted. No windows smashed. No military curfew. Instead, people gathered. In mosques under neem trees at soccer fields, they gathered to understand, not to protest. To ask, if this is the price of saying no, are we ready to pay it? In Washington, a senior advisor to the US president asked, what does he think he's doing, holding the world hostage over pride? But it was not pride. It was a refusal to disappear. For decades, the world had treated Burkina Faso as a comma in someone else's sentence. A place to extract from, a name in footnotes, a flag in donor reports. But now the comma had become a full stop. Traoré did not retreat into the palace. He traveled to villages, to schools, to farmlands turning dry. In each place, he said the same thing: no one is coming to save us, so we will save each other. And the people, tired, poor, uncertain, did something unexpected. They believed him, not because of charisma, not because of campaign promises, but because for the first time a leader had made them a witness, not a spectator. In Ghana, students held forums titled, "When Saying No Becomes Survival." In Niger, a youth coalition launched a campaign, "Our Land, Our Voice." But in the West, Traore was painted with thicker brushes. French media accused him of harboring militias. British pundits called him a pawn of Russia. Economists warned of hyperinflation, collapse, isolation. Yet on the ground, the opposite was happening. No mass exodus, no collapse, no chaos, just preparation. Nkaya Mariama received a box from an anonymous sender. Inside 20 notebooks, a dozen pencils, and a short note that read, "We heard what he said. Teach them why it matters." She wept not for the gift, but for what it meant, that the world might isolate them, but their spirit was becoming contagious. One night as he stood at the northern border watching dust storms move like omens across the Sahel, Traoré turned to his aide and asked, "Do you know what they fear the most?" Us saying no, the aide guessed. Traoré shook his head. "No, they fear that after we say no, we still stand." They expected riots. They expected the streets of Ouagadougou to swell with hunger and anger. They expected protests outside government buildings, calls for resignation, maybe even a military mutiny. What they did not expect was silence, and then movement. Not on television, not on the news, but in fields, in classrooms, in abandoned factories with broken roofs. The IMF froze all disbursements. France blocked transactions from 4 major banks. 2 global food distributors halted shipments due to market volatility. 3 NGOs suspended education grants. The message was clear: if you won't sell us your gold, we'll starve your schools. But what followed was not chaos. It was recalibration. In the city of Koudougou, a retired engineer turned an old bus depot into a community grain mill. In the town of Sapui, students gathered under mango trees to teach each other algebra by lantern light. Nkaya Mariama Zongo painted over her school's faded motto and replaced it with a single sentence: "If they won't feed our children, we'll teach them how to grow food." The twist wasn't in what the West did. It was in what Burkina Faso no longer needed: permission. For decades, every reform began in donor meetings. Every budget awaited foreign review. Now farmers held cooperatives in their courtyards. Artisans reopened workshops with no subsidies. Nurses treated patients with local herbs when imported medicine was blocked. They didn't wait. They didn't protest. They built. And what rattled the world most was the absence of panic. No hashtags, no desperate flights out of the country, no pleas for re-entry into trade blocs, just a quiet kind of defiance, like a drumbeat under soil. Western analysts called it unsustainable. Diplomats warned of long-term consequences. But inside Burkina Faso, something else was spreading ownership. People were beginning to believe that the nation did not belong to a party, a policy, or a president, but to them. And belief once planted is harder to uproot than any regime. A French official was quoted off record: "We tried to isolate them, but we might have just set them free." One night, as a dust storm swept over the rooftops of Fadanagurma, a small boy stood outside his mother's grain shop and asked Mama if they don't help us anymore. "Are we alone?" She kneeled, placed her palm over his chest and whispered, "No, we have each other now. And that's stronger than help." No flag was raised, no trumpet blew, no foreign observer came to declare it so. But across Burkina Faso, something had broken, not the nation, but the fear. In the red soil of Ziniare, old men tilled with blistered hands, not for profit but for proof. In Kaya, a child brought his mother a seed and said, "Let's plant something that doesn't need permission to grow." In the capital, the lights stayed dim, but the people glowed. Because dignity once harvested doesn't rot. It multiplies. It passes from hand to hand like water from a calabash, from mothers to sons, from teachers to students, from one silent refusal to a continent-wide awakening. Traoré did not give them prosperity. He gave them back the right to build it. And for the first time in a generation, Africa stood not in protest, but in participation. If this story stirred your spirit, don't scroll past. Like, comment, subscribe, and tell us. What seed will you plant when the world tells you to bow? Because now, the world is watching. And this time we write the ending ourselves.